some time clinically to really think about, as clinicians, what are some skills that we can have in our toolbox or understandings for how we can ground ourselves and when we're offering support from a culturally affirming lens. And so we'll go through these main components of the presentation, keeping an eye on on the clock, because even though an hour and a half seems like a hefty time, it really isn't. This is an entire field and probably, entire graduate course, and probably 3 graduate courses wrapped into 1 hour and a half talk. And so we will do our best and make it through these 3 components. And Jack is here to help keep me on track in terms of timing. And so it's important for us, right, to really understand the impact of domestic violence in our communities. So I use the term, just a quick note about terminology. I use domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and gender-based violence interchangeably when I'm talking in this discussion. Each of them, the field kind of also goes back and forth. Honestly, depending on what organization I'm working with, I defer to their language that they use when they're working. So even with some of our Spanish-speaking communities, they'll say violencia entre familias, so family violence, right? So there's different terminology that we use, and depending on the organization, I default to, but you'll also see these different terms interchangeable in the literature as well. So if you're ever doing research, make sure you type in those three terms, search terms, if you want to capture the IPV or domestic violence literature. So just wanted to do a quick side note on that. And so when we're looking at the data, right, I think oftentimes what folks ask is like, how are the rates of domestic violence in comparison to other groups, right? Now, I will say we are careful about how we talk about the rates of domestic violence because of how our community has been portrayed in the media, and more recently politically, how we're, stereotypes of us being more violent and our men being machista, right? There is, I think for practitioners, we grapple with how to talk about the rates when we're talking outside in public, right? But this is a safe space, so we're going to talk about the numbers the way we know them. And the numbers do say that domestic, Latinas do experience higher rates of domestic violence compared to non-Hispanic white individuals. Again, as you all know, those of you who are researchers, it really depends on the framing of the study, if they're able to get, the sampling. And what we know, though, either way, is that the likelihood that these rates are low is actually pretty significant, because this is one of the issues that we just don't report. And so anytime you see rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, unfortunately, you can probably assume that the rates are actually higher than what the studies are showing us. And so that's what practitioners consistently tell us. Latina women, unfortunately, are at higher risk and disproportionately impacted by intimate partner homicide. And so it's important that we'll talk about today to really understand the risk factors and the protective factors of domestic violence, because we are talking about potential for homicide. And in our community, it's a real thing. And it is something not to fearmonger, right? And it's something for us to really continue to understand, have trainings like this where we really can help buffer, right, and lean into the protective factors that can support our community members, knowing that rates of violence we do disproportionately experience rates of violence against our communities. And so we'll talk more today, right, about what intersecting factors contribute to this and what contextually we can understand. We also know domestic violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so For Latinas, and specifically on this slide, we're talking about individuals who self-identify as Latinas, identify having experienced sexual abuse in their history as well. And oftentimes we understand that our communities experience multiple forms of trauma. We'll talk more about that today, but sexual abuse being one of them, and one that unfortunately just often starts in childhood for many of our community members. When we also understand one layer of this, right, when we think about understanding how early this starts, we see data that talks about dating violence, and our community actually also experiences higher rates of dating violence in adolescence. So studies that show that as young as 10, 11 years old, Latino youth are experiencing or reporting unhealthy dynamics in their young relationships. And our LGBTQ youth as well, similar rates report dating violence. So this is violence that happens in the context of dating. Now, terminology, depending on what generation of youth, right, is always a thing to be able to capture this accurately. But for our understanding is that our youth, younger individuals, right, in our communities are also experiencing dating violence dynamics in their partnerships. Let me pause real quick. I saw a prompt of a question. Is there anything, Jack, that I should
Yeah,
answer
there's a
right now?
question, and I wasn't sure if this is something you want to answer now or it'll be answered later.
Sure.
And I think this leads to a lot of the curiosity that people have and wanting to learn related to this topic. So the question is, I have been seeing a lot of interpersonal partner violence in my Latina, Hispanic populations. Is there a reason for this or a cultural value that may impact this?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Great question. I'll kind of, let me write that note for myself. So we will go through kind of cultural understandings in just in a little bit. So I'll come back to that. Thank you. Okay. So other intersecting traumas that are impacting our community, as many of you all know who work in our community, the changing border policies, right? When we think of other forms of violence, human trafficking is a form of violence, again, because of the intersection of different identities within our communities, immigration status, right? Types of work that we do. I mean, the Latina community is the labor force of this country. And so unfortunately, that puts us in a position to be in a vulnerable position for things like human trafficking. And so we are seeing that the changing border policies are also impacting incidences of human trafficking. So you can already hear, right, in just the numbers that we're painting, a pretty complex picture of the different intersecting factors that impact our community members and the different layers of trauma and violence, right, that we might want to be aware of. It might not be just one, it's never, I will say, not never, it's less likely that it's just one, right? Like the rates show us that we need to be aware of not only domestic violence, but the intersections of domestic violence with sexual abuse, human trafficking, other forms of violence. That's why some scholars are really more moving towards this lens of gender-based violence as a way to understand this more of a broad umbrella that captures the various forms of violence that we experience in our community. Because just looking at one is, as you can see, it's just one sliver of the pie.